Welcome back. This is week one, lecture one. So this is the first lecture of the course. But I say welcome back because if you are watching this, I hope you've already watched the welcome video, which sets kind of the parameters for the course a bit. And I'll be talking more about that today. How to get started. I would hope that you've introduced yourself and maybe you've already read the some of the preliminary documents, the syllabus and things. So that is going to be important, I think. So given that, this is where we really start. And on the syllabus, the subtitle for this course, after Introduction, Reformation, or Revolution, is Theology, Religion, Politics, and History. And what that is getting at is how do we approach the Reformation? How do we conceptualize it? And what was it to begin with? And there are various different approaches to it. Theological approaches, religious approaches, historical, political, and on we could go. And I'm going to be talking about some of those issues in this lecture. I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible because this really gets into the philosophy of history. How do we do history? What's it all about? Which then also entails historical epistemology. How can we know the past? On what basis can we know the past? And what is real to begin with? And in what context are we talking about what is real and what is true, and how we approach and come to an understanding of that which the term Reformation signifies. And we'll be talking more about that as we go along, but that's what we're really getting at. Now, to get going here, I'm going to read you your final exam. And this is a 100% online asynchronous course. But your final exam, which is comprehensive, should be a semester-long project. And it's asking the very simple question, was the Reformation a revolution? If so, how so? If not, how not? So let me just read that to you, and we'll go from there, because this is the question that you're going to have to be answering on your final exam. Was the Reformation, in its religio-theological, political, social, cultural, and intellectual aspects, a revolution? If so, how so? If not, how not? How should the transformation of European society and culture from medieval to early modern be best described? So that is the task that is set before you. And this entire course is geared towards answering that question, or let's say helping you answer that question. There's no right or wrong answer on that question. There are good answers and bad answers, and I'll be talking more about that as we get closer to it too. The issue is how well do you analyze and use the course material, namely the lectures, the assigned readings, the textbook, and the other assigned readings, to deal with the problem that's given you. And the problem that's given you is that question of was the Reformation a revolution? Which means we have to understand what is a revolution. And we have to understand what the Reformation is. And how do we come to an understanding of this transition? Because however we label it, Europe in 1300, everyone would agree, I believe, every historian, was very different from Europe in 1600. Even though some aspects of society, especially the peasantry, there was very little difference, actually, between Europe in 1300 and Europe in 1600. But based on the sources that we have, which is the only thing that we can base our portrayals of quote-unquote the past on, for the elites, for the politics, for the structures of society, things had changed drastically. Now, we live in an age when change has become increasingly huge. I know that's not a very scientific way of putting it or a very historical way of putting it, but we are experiencing change at a far greater rate than ever before. So that the difference between 1900 and 2000 is a lot greater than the difference between 1300 and 1600. The difference between 1950 and 2020 is much greater. And in some ways, we could almost argue that the difference between 2000 and 2024, or 25 now, is greater than the differences between 1300 and 1500, or 1600, sorry. It all comes down to labels. How do we label these changes? Because there were changes that we can identify, describe, and discuss their effects and importance. But how we choose to label them affects our understanding of them. Was the Reformation a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Was it neutral? What was it based on? How we answer those questions, to a large extent, is not based on the historical record, the sources and evidence that are extant still, but how we understand that evidence. Now, whatever you think about the Reformation, whatever conceptions you have of it coming into this course, I hope this course will challenge those conceptions and cause you to rethink how we understand whatever it is that this term, the Reformation, signifies. Okay, that is kind of a long introduction in terms of what we're doing here and how we're approaching it. It already impinges in some ways upon this concept of Reformation. But when we then move to the first slide here, the Reformation, with the in quotation marks, we have then a further problematic of understanding what this thing is. Because was there one thing that was the Reformation? Or were there multiple Reformations? I believe, if memory serves, your textbook, Limburg, uses the plural, European Reformations. I will be talking about the patterns of Reformation as we go through this course. The Reformation is difficult to conceive of as a single thing. It is an umbrella term. I also will be talking a fair amount about the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which is a term I coined based on my book, my Luther book that you'll be reading significant amounts of, which is distinct from the 16th century Reformation. So when we approach this chronological period in history, roughly 1300 to 1600, are we talking about a single movement, a single event, so to speak, or are we talking about a vast variety and disparate developments and movements that are all grouped together under this term, the Reformation? If so, then how can we really define what the Reformation is or was? Because it all depends on what is our basis for doing so. And it also depends on the questions we ask. Do we have a theological approach to it, or a political, or a social, or religious, or economic, or an intellectual understanding of these developments? And someone else said we have to have all of the above if we really want to understand what's going on. That is one of the problems with historical periodization, because it's all artificial. The fall of Rome, as we'll see, I'll be talking about, maybe, I'm not sure if I'll be talking about that next lecture or not, in the basic structures of Christendom. I will a bit. There's no such thing as the fall of Rome. Nowhere in the sources is there any indication of Rome having fallen. The only time we find the fall of Rome is with Edward Gibbon, who in 1776 published the first of 5 volumes under the title The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It was his labeling and understanding of the developments And that has become stuck in our historical understanding and then read back into the sources as an event itself. Now, that is just one example. The same thing with the Reformation. Same thing with the Renaissance. It's been said repeatedly. I do not know who first said this, but the Renaissance sprang from the head of Jakob Burckhardt as Athena from the head of Zeus. Now, Burckhardt was a 19th century Swiss historian. He wrote a 2-volume study of the Renaissance in Italy, the Italian Renaissance in Italy. Classic, brilliant work. Very flawed from what we know today. And I may talk a bit more about this later too, because we get really our concept of the Dark Ages from Burckhardt. But there was no real discussion of, oh, this is a Renaissance. Now, the scholars at the time felt that they were effecting a rebirth of classical civilization. So in that sense, the term Renaissance, which means rebirth, renaissance, does accurately describe how they were viewing themselves. Now, whether they were actually doing that is another question. The same way the term reformatio and reformare in Latin, the terms, the verb and the noun, was used at the time. And that is the basis for my use of the term and creation of the term the Reformation of the Late and Middle Ages, because the term reformatio was a concept at the time in the 14th, 15th centuries, before Luther, before the onset of the 16th century, and what is traditionally been referred to as the Reformation. It has often been then denigrated in scholarship to being late medieval reform. But late medieval reform is not the same as Reformation. So you see right here, we are getting at the meaning that is inherent in the terms we use to describe the past. We need to analyze these terms, focus on them, question them. How do they affect us in our very understanding of the so-called the past, that which does no longer exists? And are we being fair and accurate? And are we trying to understand the past in our own terms? Or in the terms of the past as they tried to understand themselves? That is something that is a major distinction to be made, and is part of our various frames of reference, including the issue of theology and history. Because so often the Reformation has been approached theologically from the time itself, which is different from history. And there's a long historiography, which is the history of history, on this issue. And for example, the major journal focused on Reformation studies was the Archive for Reformation History, Archive for Reformationsgeschichte, a joint establishment in the 19th century, later 19th century, by Germans and Americans. And that was the major journal, academic journal for Reformation scholarship, until the 1960s, when some scholars said, you know what, this is simply church history. We're not doing that. We're not really into the theology of what was going on. We're more into the social and cultural history of what is going on. And they succeeded, so to speak, from the Archive for Reformation History and established the 16th Century Journal and the 16th Century Study Society. So that has now become the major journal for the Reformation, 16th Century Studies. And every year there's a conference, in the 16th Century Studies Conference. And there you will certainly find papers on theology of the Reformation. But the whole impetus behind this move was that we can't understand the Reformation. We can't understand what happened during the course of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries if we just focus on the theology. It was far broader than that. To the extent that there were trends and tendencies of the social historians to claim that theology, we know, is just hallucination anyway. It's the, as Marx said, it's the opiate of the people. It's illusion, as Freud would put it, and it's pretty much not reality. So we're not going to look at that. We just kind of dismiss it, and let's look at what was really going on, which was the politics and the social developments. And the theological issues were simply the superstructure. Now, that led to a lot of very great work, important work, and research on the sources that the church historians and theologians were ignoring. What was missing on both sides, in my view, was an understanding of the distinction between the history of theology and historical theology. As I use these terms, and this is in some ways the topic of your discussion for this week, as I use these terms, the history of theology is treating theology historically, whereas historical theology is treating history theologically. There's a huge difference. And here I'm going to throw something out, because this is going to be extremely important for the rest of this course, because this course at Indiana University, public university, focuses almost exclusively on the history of theology with respect to the Reformation, and not historical theology. This is not a course in theology, even though we're going to be talking a lot about theology, because my point and argument is that we can't dismiss theology from understanding what was going on in the Reformation. And we have to have that basic theological understanding to know what the history actually was in the historical developments. But we do not present a theological interpretation of it. Here's a good illustration. For the historian, as I say, qua historian, or the historian as historian, the statement that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, died, and was buried, and descended into hell. On the third day he rose again from the grave, and ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of God, from which he will come again to judge the living and the dead. Whether that is a true statement or not, namely the statements of faith, the creed, whether that is a true statement for the historian as historian is completely irrelevant. That's not something that the historian can ever determine, because there's no historical evidence. What is for the historian to determine, and for which there is abundant evidence, is that so many people believed that that was true. The beliefs of the past that are documented are essential for understanding the history. Whether those beliefs are true or false or legitimate, whether we agree with them or not, we cannot dismiss them if we seek to come to an understanding of what was happening at the time. Now, every historian has their own theological beliefs, even if that is coming from an atheistic position, as I've also argued in a recent book of mine. An atheistic position still is one that is based on faith, but that's another issue, so to speak. And if you're interested, I can certainly fill you in on a lot about that in terms of my view of things. Anyway, the point here is that whatever the religious, theological, philosophical views of the historian are, the point is not to defend those views. The point is to understand how people in the past understood their world. That is a huge task, and a difficult task. We cannot try to be objective, and I'll probably be saying this repeatedly. There is, everyone is biased, and bias is seen as the big horror of history that destroys objectivity. In my view, there is no such thing as objectivity. It's a false concept and actually warps our approach because it kind of covers things up. We can never get away from our own point of observation, which is what bias is. It's just the effects of our point of observation on our observation itself. We need to be aware of our biases, and we need to try to account for them in our interpretation. If, for example, I thought it was absolutely vile that heretics were put to death, I need to try to come to an understanding of why that was just the general assumption of what was good and needed. And here I'm not talking about the Middle Ages, I'm talking about the 16th century. As we'll see, Protestants killed heretics just as much as Catholics. Well, maybe not just as much, but almost. Michael Servetus in 1553 was executed, burned at the stake in Geneva under Calvin for heresy. So if we just dismiss that as being idiocy or lunacy or ignorance, we're not understanding what was going on. Now, I'm not for advocating the burning of heretics. Honestly, I'm not. We could talk about it, maybe whether or not, but that's another issue. But that's not the point. The point is not to look back and condemn for the historian as an historian. It's to understand, how was this possible? How was it possible that these developments came about? How is it possible that these sources, these artifacts, these pieces of evidence are still extant? The sources themselves, the artifacts themselves, that which exists today, question us and force us to answer the question, why are we here? And what do we mean? And what did we mean? That's what the historical task is, and the historical endeavor, to come to an understanding of that which is. When it comes down to it, doing history is not about the past. The past doesn't exist. It's about the present, and coming to an understanding of ourselves and how we got here. That's what it's all about. Now, that's a long approach, and somewhat rambling maybe, but it is important for setting the stage, so to speak, of what we're doing in this course, at least in my conception of what we are doing. And that is an important conception to grasp, even if you do not share it. I'll be talking about that in terms of your text analyses and the final two, that you are not required to share my views, but you are required to try to understand my views. And if you disagree with them based on the course material, to present an argument against them. Now, we'll be talking more about that when we get there. But this is all a way to say that this final exam that you have to be writing come late April, May, gets at the very core of what we're doing in this course. How do we come to an understanding, and how do we label, how do we describe our analysis and understanding of what we observe of the sources? And was the Reformation then a Reformation, or was it a revolution? And what difference does that distinction even have for our understanding of the past and its impact on the further development of Western history and of ourselves today? You say, whoa, that's too much. Of course it's too much. This is also the other problem of history. We're always dealing with too much. We're always trying to do the impossible, because it is impossible to explain the past. It's too complex. That's why, too, I argue that history is the most difficult discipline you can study, because it deals with human beings, and human beings are infinitely complex. Why do we do what we do? Who are we? How do we understand ourselves and our world? Those things is what the historian tries to get at, and it's impossible, but we cannot not try. Because if we don't try, we allow for an increase in amnesia, forgetfulness, because in some ways history is simply memory, and memory is identity. So if we lose our understanding of history, we lose our identity of who we are. You say, well, no, that's just applies to U.S. history. Well, we will see that there are very strong connections between the Reformation, however that is conceived, and the early colonial period in the U.S. So that we really can't understand what was going on in the colonial U.S. without understanding something about the Reformation. And that's just because everything is connected. That's what we're getting at. Everything is connected. And how we kind of bring it all together in the different frames of references, the different questionings of theological questions, political questions, social, religious, economic, and intellectual questions, are all part of the same endeavor. And how do we get there? That then brings me then to belief, truth, and history, which I've already talked about, even if not quite as directly as here on the slide. I have already talked about the issue between the beliefs of the historian and the beliefs of people in the past, and how the historian as historian is not and cannot be, to do good history, that is, trying to defend and support their own positions, their own beliefs, but rather how do we come to an understanding of the beliefs of the past that impacted the past. Now, that being a given, that is the approach. We had that, then the distinction between belief and that which we believe, which is similar to the distinction between truth and that which is true. Belief and that which we believe, it's a difficult concept to get at, even so is, well, as is the concept of the truth. Historical truth is not absolute truth. And that is one of the problems with theology, because theology, by definition almost, asserts absolute truth. Because if God is, and if God is God, and not a human creation, then God is absolutely true. Now, if you deny that God is, which is distinct from particular conceptions of God, that's a very important distinction to make. We can deny individual conceptions of God pretty easily and refute individual conceptions of God pretty easily. But it's impossible to disprove the proposition God is, just as it is impossible to disprove the proposition God is not. So the theologian is forced to make absolute assertions when we cannot be absolutely certain within temporality. And I've written a lot about this in my most recent book. So if you're interested, let me know. But that's the problem, and often we mix that up, and we approach the past as a means of justifying ourselves and defending our own beliefs and our own worldviews. And that is, in my view, directly counter to what history and the doing of history and the historical endeavor is all about, even as the beliefs in the past are essential, as I already said. Now, there is a distinction between the truth, and historians can't access the truth. The truth is a concept for philosophy and theology. But that does not mean there is no true historical statements. We can make true historical statements. And up there, too, I have then history as the science of history and historical truth in the science of history. And what that means is that, in my view, the foundation of all history, and I would argue too the foundation of all theology, that is a separate argument. The foundation of all history is a scientific approach. Now, there's a long tradition and debate about history as science. For the most part, it's been discredited. Most part, historians would say, no, history is not a science, like biology or chemistry or astrophysics. I would say it is, but it's not just that. It gets into a whole historiographical debate and gets back to the founder of modern historiography and modern history writing, Leopold von Ranke, a 19th century German, who was attributed as the person to develop a quote-unquote scientific history or history of science, whereby scientifically we can recreate and reconstruct how things actually were. Wie es eigentlich gewesen. So if you've studied German, that's the phrase, wie es eigentlich gewesen. Often, not always, but often that quotation is misquoted, because von Ranke did write that, wie es eigentlich gewesen. And it is quoted as wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, or wie es eigentlich gewesen war, where it makes it a particular, perfect grammatical form, whereas von Ranke left it open. And for von Ranke, it doesn't mean that we can reconstruct the way the past really was. It means we can come up with an understanding of an approximation of how it could have been. The eigentlich is a difficult German word to translate because it can mean really, or it can mean about, sort of, maybe. And it's that latter sense that von Ranke was using it. But what we have to do is base our analysis on that which is in existence, the sources. And there, that has to be approached scientifically. Meaning manuscripts, artifacts, ruins, textual fragments, all this evidence has to be approached scientifically. How do we date them? Etc., etc., etc. And only on that basis can we then move on, as did von Ranke, to claim that history is also art. And von Ranke argued very clearly that history is always necessarily science and art. And the art side of things with von Ranke was like ignored and dropped out of interpretations or uses of von Ranke, and then he was dismissed as being, that's impossible to do. He also wrote a history of the Reformation, von Ranke, as well as a history of the popes. Anyway, it is a scientific analysis of the extant evidence. But then we have to go beyond, because that doesn't have any meaning. To claim that this particular manuscript was written in 1402 by a German hand, and is ascribed to a man by the name of Leonardo Bruni, for example. That doesn't mean anything. That's what it signifies. So often we equate something that signifies with the meaning of it. And that is a big distinction to make between the meaning and the signification. Now, in a broad, general sense, that which a thing signifies is that which it means in a general sense, but in a more specific sense, no. The fact that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg doesn't mean anything until we interpret it, until we give it meaning, just as people at the time gave it meaning. But it signifies things. What does it signify? Number one, it signifies that Luther constructed these theses. Then we have to ask, why and on what basis? They were constructed for an academic university debate. within the theology department at the University of Wittenberg. They weren't posted as a protest against the church at all. We'll be talking a lot more about that as we go, when we get there. But that still doesn't get at what they mean. It's a different level of understanding. So we need to distinguish between the signification and determining the signification of things, of sources, of evidence, of words is scientific. The meaning is artistic. And that's where we have to try to bring those two frames of interpretation and understanding together, the scientific and the artistic. Because if we only have the scientific, we lose meaning. And if all we have is the artistic, we lose the very foundation of reality. I mean, even, let's say, artists also need science. The science of colors, the science of textures, the science of sculptures. If they don't understand that in some fashion, their vision, their insight won't be realized. Same thing for the historian. So we approach this and approach the trying to coming to an understanding of the past and of history in general and of the history of the Reformation in particular, both as history of science and history as art, where we are finding meaning. And there is then too a further distinction that I make regarding the concept of truth. It is analogous to this distinction between science and art. Also, as I'll be talking about in the Middle Ages and through the 16th century, the term science, what we refer to today as science, was simply scientia. In Latin, scientia simply means knowledge. So all knowledge was science by definition. Therefore, in the Middle Ages, theology was the queen of the sciences because it was the highest form of knowledge. And in many ways, that was the case throughout the Reformation. It was only towards the end of the 16th century that we begin to see this distinction between, let's say, natural philosophy, as it has always been known. I'll say a lot about medieval science, and then maybe address some of that in the next lecture. But between natural philosophy and then other types of knowledge, and where knowledge then is restricted to scientific knowledge, what today we refer to as scientific knowledge. That there is scientific knowledge that is true. We can make true statements, even if we cannot claim absolute understanding. Even our understanding of the universe is based on the information that we have at this particular time. And that is always subject to change, subject to reform and reformation based on new evidence. There's also something called, or what I call, mythopoetical truth. The truth of poetry, the truth of love, the truth of art is definitely true, in my view. But it's not scientific truth. And it cannot be reduced to that. And if we reduce all truth to scientific truth, we live in a much impoverished world, in my view. So I hope we would never lose that mythopoetical truth. Is there truth in music? Oh my gosh, is there ever? And here I'm not talking about pop songs. I'm talking about classical music. But maybe there's truth in pop songs too. I know there is some things, there are songs I really like. And I think are true. Anyway, that's another beside the point. The issue here that for me, as I approach the 16th century Reformation historically, religion and theology are true in the sense of mythopoetical truth, even if our understanding of that truth has to be based on scientific truth. That's what we're getting at. And that's those distinctions need to be made, because if we start mixing them up, we're then just beginning to do bad history and or idolatrous bad theology. And our understanding is completely hindered and almost excluded by definition, because it will be completely erroneous if we don't keep those distinctions in place, and if we start to mix categories. That's always a problem. I mean, proverbial apples and oranges. And if we start to accept oranges as being apples, we're not going to understand what happens with apples. So those are the differences between the belief, truth, and history as we approach the past in general and the 14th through 16th century in particular as history and the development thereof that has been labeled the Reformation. And how can we find the truth of that history? And that truth of that history in part has to be based on the belief of the time. Because if we base it on our belief, we're just trying to mold the past into our own beliefs rather than have the beliefs of the past question our beliefs. Because our beliefs have been historically formed. That is also another major issue. I mean, that's the point, is questioning ourselves, coming to a greater understanding of ourselves, as I've already indicated and said, in terms of history. And the point of history and why we do history is for the present, not for the past. But for the present, it's not to use the past. It is to come to an understanding of the past, to allow the past to critique and question our present, to question who we are and how we got here. Now, whether that's politically, philosophically, socially, religiously, or theologically, it's all one part of the one and same thing. All an attempt to find meaning for ourselves in where we find ourselves. And here I have then systems of meaning. I have meaning and meaning 2 or 4. Theology, religion, and historical understanding. There is a difference between, let's say, scholarly meaning and individual meaning, or meaning 2 or 4. This is an example. My favorite poet is T.S. Eliot. I love T.S. Eliot. Not everything he wrote. And the bit that I've read about him personally, I think he was probably pretty much of a pompous asshole. I really probably would not have liked him as an individual. But his poetry, at least some of it, I love. It is very, very important to me. It means a great deal to me. I don't want to read scholarly critiques of Eliot. I'm not an Eliot scholar. I don't want to be an Eliot scholar. Why? Because a part of me is afraid that if I started to study Eliot academically, I would learn that my understanding of Eliot is faulty. And so what Eliot means to me now would be contradicted by what scholars say the meaning of Eliot actually is or was. Now, I can keep those two things distinct. So, okay, it doesn't matter what Eliot himself meant, because that is only one frame of reference of meaning, and what Eliot's poetry means to me is also valid. I think that's very true. It is valid to me, or for me, what this means to me or for me. And if it is, quote unquote, there, it is there. Meaning, if I can base my understanding of Eliot and what Eliot means to me on Eliot's actual poetry, and not something that I create or mix up, or bring in some other poetry that actually was not by Eliot. I mean, there has to be some basis in actuality and reality, so to speak, besides just my own creation in terms of Eliot. But as it's been argued, if there is a meaning that can be discerned in a text, that meaning is valid, whether the author intended it, whether anybody else has seen it or discerned it. It all depends on what that meaning is based on and for whom or to whom. Now, we'll be talking about this, and I would also argue this is a theological point, but again, this is not a course in theology, this is a course in history. The Bible is a text, and people read the text, and it can mean things to individuals. It can mean things to me, it can mean things to you, and those two meanings may disagree. The question is, though, academically, in terms of scholarship and biblical scholarship, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that what the Bible means to me or a particular passage is illegitimate, but I have to make that distinction between what it means to me and then the scholarly academic understanding of it, which is more of the scientific understanding of it, which is actually taking it out of my own context and understanding it in its own context. That is a difficult distinction to make, but it's one we must make, or we again are simply reading our own meaning and understanding into the past. And that applies to basically theology and religion. Whatever religious tradition you come from, or none at all, religion itself is a system of meaning. And no religion is a system of meaning, depending on what we mean by meaning now, or religion. The reading for this week is kind of an essay of my own, History, Theology, Myth, and Religion, where I go through and give more definitions. I hope perhaps more succinctly than I'm doing in this lecture right here and now. That I hope will form, or should form, the basis for our common understanding of these terms and concepts for the rest of the course. So it's like, okay, that document is going to be fundamental, because if we want to define theology, if we want to define religion, if we want to define history or myth, you have a very particular definition of myth, we need to have a common basis. Because if we're arguing about, well, yeah, but that's not myth, that's something else, it's like, that's not going to work, so we need to have a common understanding. And this reading for this week, for this first week, offers the definitions that we're going to be using in this course for our understanding of these terms that are going to be we're going to be coming across and using constantly. Now, again, I'm not saying that these are the absolute true definitions of these terms. They're the definitions that I'm using for this course and that I want you to use for this course, or at least to understand. If you were to offer a different definition, that would be okay, but then you would need to really define your terms and on what basis your definition is constructed. And here we have to come back to the historical understanding and definition, not a theological or a religious one, if that makes any sense. But it's all about seeking meaning, which is attributed to the sources. It's what we do when we start reading a text. We are ascribing meaning to this thing. The Bible doesn't mean a thing until we read it. It's just a text. The same for every other theological text. Now, you could say, well, there's a meaning behind it. The authors had a meaning that they're trying to explain. Fine. But that is something that is not clear and evident. We can't say that the author of the Gospel of John meant a certain thing by starting out in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We can't say what that meaning was to the author. We have no access to what was in the author's mind or heart or anything else. We have to find the meaning and try to discern what does that text mean. And this applies to all human texts. And if we are talking about texts that are seen as divine revelation, it's even more important. Now, again, the historian, keeping with that distinction, historian, quad historian, as historian, cannot comment on revelation. But we can comment on what people considered to have been revelation and believed to have been revelation. Now, these distinctions, again, for that document, I hope you will read and go over and review from time to time, because they're going to be essential for our coming to an understanding of what this course is all about, what that which the term Reformation signifies was all about, and to see how Europe changes during this 300-year period as your final exam articulates. How do we come to understand this distinction between, let's say, Europe in 1300 and Europe in 1600, the change from medieval to early modern, which too are historiographical terms. But there's change was going on, historical change. And we can say there's also cultural change, intellectual change, theological change, yes. But again, we're approaching this historically, whereby religious change, theological change are as important as political change, but we have to understand it all historically, not theologically or religiously. It's not an issue of this is the right type of change, this is the wrong type of change. We have to say, what made this change possible? How can we come to an understanding of it? And we can't appeal to divine causation historically. So, we need to look at the historical factors, of which there are numerous ones in here on agents of historical change. I have categories of factors: political, intellectual, social, economic, theological, and religious. These all work together. And only when we can start to try to see how they work together can we come to an historical understanding of the past. Now, if we focus on a particular factor, that's fine. In research, we have to. And the focus of my research is the religious and theological history of 14th through early 16th century. But we have to also realize that is part of a larger structure. We can't just say, therefore, this was the cause of things. So, yeah, but perhaps not the only cause, perhaps not even the most important cause or significant cause. And yet, that whole approach to saying this caused this works scientifically. It doesn't work artistically in terms of history as art, because it can't really get at the human being. What caused me? What caused you? What caused you to sign up for this course? There's all kinds of different factors and all kinds of different levels of causation. Causation is not the point of doing history. We are not here to explain the past scientifically in terms of causation. That form of scientific history is not viable and has been debunked, and that's that. We're here to understand, for insight, for the artistic truth of that change, for which we need a scientific analysis of the sources that allow us to say anything at all about, quote unquote, the past. And we have to realize that the complex of causes, the political, intellectual, social, theological, religious, all work together. They did in the past, they still do. We can take them out to look at them heuristically, so to speak. But when we're looking at the flesh and blood and how history really worked, we have to be aware that they all work together. Now, I think the final exam, if I can get back up here, How should the transformation of European society and culture from medieval to early modern be best described? And in what sense was it a revolution in terms of its religio-theological, political, social, cultural, intellectual? That's an impossible question. But you have to try to start to learn to deal with the complexity. And how do we deal with the complexity when we can't even represent the complexity, but we have to try? We have to reduce the complexity to something that's manageable. And if we don't realize that we're doing that, that's the danger. If we don't realize that we can't get at the full complexity of how things developed and say, this is the way it was, that is historically analogous to idolatry theologically. Because what is idolatry? Idolatry is making the infinite finite, or the atemporal temporal. As I've argued, all theology is inherently idolatrous because it is by definition temporal. It is trying to come up with a conception of that which cannot be conceived. That's a theological argument, not a historical argument. But historically, it's the same thing. If we reduce the complexity, the infinite complexity of human beings in the past to a single cause or a couple of single different causes, we are warping the past. So what the trick is to be as unidolatrous as possible, to be as reductionist as possible, by being consciously aware constantly of the complexity that we cannot grasp and get at. So your final exam is asking you to do the impossible. I know that. But give it your best shot. Now, we'll talk more about that when we get there. So, the whole goal of this course, the whole reason we start questioning these terms that we use, is to come to an understanding of the past, even though that understanding is always partial. Only partial. Now here, I am hesitating to do this because I'm about ready to make a theological statement here, but the analogy, if you know what I'm talking about, great. If you don't worry about it. It's Paul. We see in a mirror darkly. We see in a mirror darkly. We can only see through shadows. We can only see, the little glimpses of insight from a given point of observation into the whole complexity of humanity in the past. And that's not only because the sources are limited. We don't have the sources for everything. But that's what our task is, and we're constantly confronted with failure, and yet we must try to come to some kind of understanding, because it's all based on coming to an understanding of ourselves, who we are in our world, and how did we get here. That's what this course is about. That's what the Reformation, the studying the Reformation, was about. And that's what the Reformation itself was about for the time. Now, in terms of the points of departure for this course and the parameters of this course and where to begin, the whole issue of periodization is problematic. I've already said repeatedly, it's like approximately 1300 to 1600. We'll see some of the reasons for choosing those signposts, so to speak. But in terms of this change, from 1300 to 1600, I put it in terms of a paradigm change, which is actually a term borrowed from Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher and historian of science. I'll talk more about that as we go along. But a paradigm change from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, whereby we are still working with the myth of Christendom in 1300, but sometime between, let's say, 1530 and 1600, we've already slipped over into the myth of the nation state. That transformation we'll be talking a lot more about as we go through this course. So if you're saying, what are you talking about? As I read the assigned reading for this week, and that will help give insight into my understanding of myth and how I'm using the term myth, etc. And it is part of the entire course is to come to understand this transformation from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, because it's looking at a transition and a paradigm change of European culture and society. And in so many ways, I would argue and claim, for the fun of it, if nothing else, we are ourselves smack dab in the middle of a paradigm change and period of transition in our world today. We're no longer a modernity. We are postmodern. That is a pretty useless term. It just means we're no longer modern. But we haven't come to a sense of what we are yet. We're still in that transitional phase. We just talk about postmodern. And what comes after postmodern? Is it post-postmodern? And then what comes after post-postmodern? Is it post-post-postmodern? These structures of cultural transformation take a while to come to an understanding of, and then to label that understanding. That's what this is all about. And trying to understand what was going on in this paradigm change and shift, the transition from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state, can help us reflect on where we are in our own paradigm shift that we're experiencing day in and day out, and we don't know what's coming next and what the end of the story is going to be, so to speak. We don't know what the new paradigm will yet be. But we can look to the past based on the excellent evidence to try to help us understand this change. Now, that's what we are doing, in my view, when we approach the Reformation. Because the Reformation is no single set thing. It is a term that signifies a whole complex of extremely complex developments that we'll be looking at just a few of, and probably only on the surface. But we'll do our best. We'll do our best to come to an understanding, or at least to come to a new understanding of this period of transition, 1300 to 1600, and how that has impacted European history and Western history ever since. That's what this course is really about. Now, that I hope sets the stage. The next lecture will be Basic Structures of Christendom, because in order to understand a shift and a change, we have to have some sort of understanding of what the shift and change was from, what was being changed. Now, obviously, we could spend a whole semester just studying the medieval Christendom. And I teach a course on early Middle Ages and high and late Middle Ages, as well as the Reformation. So it will be much condensed, but there are a few points that are essential to understand the developments that we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester. So that is why I start next week, or not next week, next lecture, with the basic structures of Christendom, the myth of Christendom, to understand what that was in part, so we can begin to see what was new and different about the developments in the 16th century. So that's where we go from here. That's our point of departure. Hopefully this lecture provided you a framework to know kind of the contours of what this course is about and what we're doing here. I hope you will read the document, History, Myth, Theology, and Religion, or whatever it is that's posted there for you, and we'll go from there. If you have any questions, as always, email me. Thank you for your patience, and I'll be back again before too long with the second lecture of this week. Thanks so much.